Welcome, everybody. We are honored to be joined here by Nick Martin, an educator, technologist, and social entrepreneur with 15 years of experience in international development and social innovation. Amongst other things, Nick Martin is CEO at TechChange, an online learning platform, a professor at Georgetown, Columbia, and George Washington University, an Edmund Hillary Fellow, a thought leader on LinkedIn, and star of the short film 10 Second Mysteries. Nick, how are you doing today?
I had forgotten about those 10-second mysteries. All right. I'm doing very well, Garrett. Excited to be here and talking with your audience and looking forward to the show.
Absolutely, absolutely. So a lot of people talk to us about questions related to many subjects that I thought you would be perfect to speak on. You have a background in entrepreneurship, but also in nonprofits. And that's a really hot question. Should people position themselves for success in the nonprofit world? And I know that you've on LinkedIn at least been presenting a lot of ideas, but what's your current thinking if you want to expound on this in kind of longer form?
Yeah, sure. I think, the first thing I usually start with is if you are interested in a career in a nonprofit or international development or humanitarian work, the first thing to do is to really ask yourself why. Really identify closely with the reasons that you want to get into this work. And then I think it's a question of some of the practicalities. What organizations are working on the issues you care about? What is their theory of change? How are they approaching and manifesting the change that they want to see in the world? And how does that resonate with your why, your intent? And then trying to grapple with some of the trade-offs, Garrett, that oftentimes come with working at a nonprofit. Sometimes less of a salary, sometimes a hectic travel schedule. And so I do try and get folks who are excited about this career path to really start to think about those early. And then there are others like, do I need a graduate degree in order to do this kind of work? Or what level should I enter the organization? And a lot of my posts more recently have been a bit more tactical about some of the skills one needs in order to work for specific organizations.
Absolutely. So do you think that people need a degree, a graduate school degree?
It's a big question. It's a huge question. I mean, you and I went to Swarthmore together, and my father always said, "Oh, you went to Swarthmore. That's such a tough school. You'll never need another degree." And of course, I did get another degree, but I did it a little differently. I went to a small school run by the United Nations in Costa Rica, and I did a one-year master's in education for peace, and it was affordable, and it was a kind of a fun, adventurous experience, and I met a lot of amazing humans on that journey. But I didn't get left or saddled with the crazy amount of debt that often folks, especially in the United States, are left with after they graduate. And now I'm a professor at Georgetown and Columbia, and I'm really seeing firsthand that my students who are studying in public policy programs and international development programs are leaving with sometimes 6 figures of debt and being offered jobs that are $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. And it's really difficult to square that math when the opportunities on the employer side just don't match up with the costs on the education side. And it's not getting better. So I think there's definitely a larger conversation to be had there.
Some years ago, there was some talk of loan forgiveness programs where if you had a degree and you went into something that was less paying, but some level contributed to social responsibility, then there would be some forgiveness of loans. Is that on the table at all these days, or is that just gone?
The infamous Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, initiated under Obama, had every intent of being, I think, a way to square this challenge. And apologies for some of the sirens in the back here. But unfortunately, in practice, this loan forgiveness program has been a complete and total disaster. Something like under 10% of the people who have applied for this program have been able to actually see it through. Now, why is that? Because the third-party implementers that actually manage the loans haven't been really clear on the communication to the folks, the alums and the students who've taken these programs. Lots and lots of red tape, lots and lots of weird, quirky expectations, legalese that if you mess up, you can start back at zero. It's really it's a 10-year process where you make the minimum loan payment every year, every month. for 10 years. And if you do one thing wrong, the clock resets. Look, I think it's a start, but it certainly was not the savior that people intended it to be.
Interesting. So is any of that at all because there's been a change in administration since this program went into effect?
It's a great question. Yes, and it was also not designed well from the beginning. And under Obama, the third-party loan providers that were designated to manage this program, one could argue they weren't set up for success by the Obama administration, but they took this even further and made more of a mess of this program. And so, look, there have been a number of Washington Post has done an expose on this. There's been a number of media outlets that have covered this. It's pretty disheartening because I know a lot of friends who went into this sector thinking, hey, you know what? If I just do everything right and I work for a nonprofit public service for 10 years, the government will forgive that loan. And they're finding that, in fact, many of the years they thought they were paying off their loans didn't count towards that program, which is pretty tragic.
Interesting. Sort of more generally, a design flaw or maybe feature of the American system is that every 4 to 8 years, the entire landscape in Washington, D.C. is going to reset. And obviously, you had some years where you're working with one administration and the administration shift. And having gone through this, what do you see as like the nonprofit view or lens on this? Is it a massive shift, or does business pretty much continue as usual when these kind of big schisms happen?
Yeah. Well, if you think about the nonprofit landscape in the United States, there's a couple different ways to think about it. All the money that is given out from the government to the nonprofit world, a lot of it is done, there's kind of several buckets. There's the kind of foreign aid bucket, and there are a whole crop of organizations, nonprofits and for-profits, that are surround USAID and essentially implement the United States policies and agendas internationally with dollars from government. And when administrations changed, there is quite a bit of disagreement or difference around how to approach international foreign aid. It's usually considered connected to defense and national security policy. It's there are many generals who will tell you, like, thank goodness for foreign aid and all great work that nonprofits do for foreign aid, because it actually makes our jobs easier. So under this administration, surprisingly to some, USAID has remained relatively intact. State Department is another story, but if you were to compare the Obama administration to the Trump administration, a number of the people have stayed on at USAID, and a number of the organizations that surround USAID, these nonprofits that employ tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, generally are still operating even with that administration change. There are also a number of historically bipartisan aid and initiatives like PEPFAR, which is a program that George Bush funded to tackle AIDS in Africa. And there are a number of Republicans and Democrats who've come together and supported that initiative, which has meant many development dollars over many years, and some consistency between and across administrations.
So sort of along this subject, fundraising is a huge deal for nonprofits, I would imagine. So would you advise that if someone is looking at getting into nonprofits, that they bone up on their fundraising skills?
Yeah. Yes, and the skills are slightly different depending on the industry. So in international development, the strategy or the architecture is you have these large proposal teams. They're called business development teams, and they submit competitive bids to the US government, and then those bids are awarded based on the quality of the proposal that the team submits. And so for a lot of entry-level applicants, joining the business development side of the house is actually an easier way to get in. And those skills you need there are obviously writing. Many times these organizations, if they have enough money, will send people to the countries that will ultimately be the basis for whatever the US government is trying to fund. So they'll do advanced research. There's a lot of research skills that go into it, but certainly writing from the proposal standpoint. Now, if you're just looking to work for a nonprofit in the United States that doesn't get funding from the US government, you still have to think about fundraising. And in that sense, you're writing proposals to foundations to fund your work. You're building your network of wealthy individuals who might care about your cause and be able to write a check. You're thinking about crowdfunding campaigns that raise small amounts of money from many people. And there are sort of a range of other skills that are needed in order to keep the lights on.
Interesting. If you had to estimate what % of your day is spent on fundraising versus on the actual day-to-day of the business?
Probably 70%. And again, I run a company, and I think that would be fairly normal. Fundraising meets business development, right? So we are a social enterprise, but we're still a company, and we're not funded through grants so much as we work for hire. We will, with a contract, execute a shared agreement around something that we designate as important and that a client needs. And so a little different. If you're a traditional nonprofit, maybe you're asking for money from a philanthropic foundation to go help another community in need, but the community is not paying for your service. So, sometimes it's good just to think about who the client is and where the money comes from.
Interesting. So if you were talking with an undergraduate student who was interested in working at TechChange, what would you advise that they do to set their resume apart and get them in the top 10% of resumes you'd consider?
So there's sort of the hard skills and the soft skills that we could talk about. And there's also some of the attitudes that I think are even more important. I mean, in terms of hard skills, because we're a tech company, certainly having the ability to do design or programming or some working with data is certainly, these are all skills that are in demand. In our case, we're also looking for teachers, people who care about education and who have experience in the classroom. And so certainly undergraduates who volunteered or worked in schools, that's useful for us. On the soft skill side, to me, it's really about like coachability and a commitment to be able to do lifelong learning. I think that the students that have been most successful at TechChange, coming out of undergrad and working, have really embraced this reality that like there's lots they don't know. They're eager to learn. They're excited about that. They're willing to take feedback. They're willing to be coached, and they don't have it all figured out. I do think that attitude is really key, and I think just the ability to roll up your sleeves. Like when you're in school, Garrett, like everything is designed to sort of service you, right? Think about all the clubs we were part of, all the cool things we got to do, that acting class we took together. Like everything was about us. When we enter the workforce, suddenly that table is turned, that dynamic is shifted, and we are now being asked to serve something larger than ourselves, a shared vision, and being paid for it. And so I think that mental leap is really difficult for folks to make. I know it was hard for me. I'm guessing maybe it's hard for you too. But we have to do it. And I think the better prepared undergrads are to make that mental switch, the better off they'll be in their journeys.
I guess you might say the difference is that before you were a paying customer, right? We were paying a lot of money for Swarthmore to cater to us. And then when we get in the real world, we're the vendor. We're having to provide skills to someone else if we want to afford to eat.
Yeah.
And then obviously, student loans is something you touched on earlier, but from my experience, when I graduated, I wanted to go and do startups, and I couldn't because I had all these student loans I had to pay off. So for my case, I found kind of interstitial steps where I could work at a startup, get some of the skills while getting enough of a salary to pay things off. And then once I got those paid off, I could kind of move into my more ideal scenario, which was getting on the founding team. Is there sort of similar approaches you could recommend for the nonprofit world? So for example, like I did work myself in and around causes that I thought were interesting and useful. I immediately graduated and worked for a presidential campaign, and that led to another job at a startup connected with the political world. And through that, I got to learn a lot about the world, enough to know that I didn't want to touch that world ever again. But it was a way of aligning my ideals and kind of all this ethical education that they taught us at Swarthmore with the harsh realities of the real world. Is there similar things in nonprofits where you might not work at a nonprofit right away if you can't afford it, but you might work at a company with a social mission? Like, what would you advise to people on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing all shades of that spectrum, and now when you graduate, there are just there are companies with social missions. There are what are called B Corps, for benefit corporations. There are big tech companies that have social good arms. There are lots of ways to volunteer without having to leave your job and to kind of get a flavor for the nonprofit world. There are lots of opportunities internationally to keep your costs low and do work in other countries. So I will be the first to agree that like the cost for these graduates, if you're graduating right now, the cost is higher than it's ever been given your loan profile. It's the flip side though is it's not necessarily the employer's fault, right? So I think a lot of folks, the way they approach it is, well, I'm just going to be extractive about my first few years after college. I'm going to gain all the skills. I'm going to float from job to job, and I'm going to basically learn everything I should have learned in college and pay off my loans. And I have issues with that. I feel like the problem is the universities are charging too much, because if you come into the workforce and you change jobs every 8 months and you make it all about your learning and your development, it does make it really hard for organizations to want to hire this sort of demographic. So that's what I would say. I think I think be respectful and grateful for the opportunities you do get in your journey. Be creative about how you kind of satisfy that nonprofit urge inside you. Be loyal to the organizations that you agree to work with. And I think that will pay benefits in the long run, right? We're on these journeys, these careers are going to be 30, 40, 50 years. You don't have to do everything in the first 2 years after you graduate.
So you mentioned undergrads that they should, do a good mix of soft skills and hard skills. You yourself were an English major. Going back,
yes.
You do a major in the hard sciences?
Such a good question. I love my English degree. I mean, what did I studied modern poetry, Shakespeare, and post-colonial lit. And I also studied education at Swarthmore, and I'm very grateful for all the experiences I had working in classrooms. And I think that really, in many ways, served as a foundation for my journey at TechChange to really think about how you take some of the power and the majesty and the energy in a classroom and translate that online. What I love about literature is that it combines the political, the social, the geopolitical, the religious, the philosophical, the psychological into stories. And we learn so much about history and the human experience through stories. And can I draw a straight line from my English degree to my business? Probably not, but certainly writing and certainly storytelling and certainly like the appreciation for the breadth of the human experience. That's powerful stuff. If I had just done a STEM degree and joined you on your physics journey, who knows? Maybe it would have worked, but I'm grateful for the experiences I had. Certainly, though, the cost of school being what it is, it does raise the stakes for a journey that doesn't sort of like hyper focus early. And I think that's why liberal arts is so under the gun is, what is the value proposition? I am spending so much gosh darn money on this.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think that on some level, people in the STEM fields are coming around to what you were talking about with the power of stories, because there's so much kind of neurochemistry into how brains are hardwired to recognize stories. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I obviously emphasized at Swarthmore was the importance of writing. And it is interesting to me at ResScore, we see a lot of very interesting technical resumes come through, and people don't know how to write a complete sentence. So
it's terrifying.
And as you were talking about some of the nonprofit world, you're spending 70% of your time working on fundraising, and a lot of that is writing grants. So there is obviously a lot of value in being able to write very effectively.
Yeah, and I think, and to build on that, Garrett, and writing in relationships, right? And so like to be an emotionally intelligent person requires a certain degree of empathy and being able to understand where somebody else is coming from. And to a certain extent, you can learn these skills and you can practice these skills. And to me, that like intersection of writing and relationships is mostly what I do. I spend all my day writing emails and going out and meeting people and talking about opportunities and trying to understand if we can really help. And a lot of that is an emotional intelligence skill set that I think one can start building undergrad, but can develop over years.
How does one become a professor?
Oh man, so many ways. For me, it was about 10 years ago, I started teaching. And what I first did is I went back to my grad school, University of Peace in Costa Rica, and I pitched them on teaching a course. And because they knew me and I knew them and I knew how it could work, they didn't have anything else on the topic. It was peace building and technology. They were open to it. And then I used that curriculum to then pitch American University here in Washington, D.C. And since my university had a relationship with American University, there was some parity. And again, they didn't have anything that had been taught. So they looked at the curriculum and they made some calls down to campus, Costa Rica. And they said, all right, this guy checks out. But they said, you have to teach with another person. And so I co-taught my first course in the United States with a more senior professor. And I worked with him on the agenda and the lesson plans and the curriculum. And we co-taught. And then I used that to pitch a course at George Washington University. And I was all this time doing 1 credit weekend courses or 5-week courses that would fall in non-traditional, but still credit granting paths that students would take in graduate school. And I preferred that because I don't want to teach over the course of a semester, but I have many colleagues who do. And so my advice would be to be open to the paired teaching, to be persistent, to find curriculum that's not taught in an existing portfolio. And if you don't know what those things are, talk to current students who are in those programs and ask them if you want to be a professor. And then, be patient, because oftentimes with these programs, like opportunities open up periodically and maybe they want you to teach something that you didn't have in mind, but it's somewhat connected and you just have to kind of jump in and do it to get into the system.
Interesting.
So there you go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have a talent for identifying kind of opportunities and around education and where you can kind of find opportunities for things that aren't being addressed, and you're fitting yourself very well into it. And I think that's on some level the thesis behind Tech Change, which is focused on the intersection of technology and education. Now, obviously, there's been a ton of changes in technology and education over the past few years. Is there, kind of a short version you can give to me who has not been in the field?
Oh man, Garrett, so much. Where we sit, we're looking at emerging technologies, but we're also looking at, when we started, it was all about the rise of the mobile device in the developing world. This just phenomenal access people had to technology in their pockets. And as the years have evolved, I think we've seen other emerging technologies really steal the show, from blockchain to artificial intelligence to drones, and each one has a specific potential application for how they could address global challenges. And we've also seen specific sectors in nonprofit and international development work benefit from technology. Everything from mobile devices being used to provide public health care to pregnant mothers, to monitoring crops and predicting weather patterns with AI technology for farmers. I mean, really, the list goes on. And so our challenge at Tech Change is trying to figure out, all right, what's on the bleeding edge, and then how does that relate to what countries around the world might find useful, and then how do we package that into curriculums in the form of skills and case studies and narratives. And so that's the thoroughfare that we're sitting between, is this cutting edge stuff versus what can be directly applied to hard to reach contexts.
Mm-hmm. Are these changes in technology going to render schools obsolete, or will schools have a piece in the ecosystem?
Well, what schools, what level, what countries? I mean, there's so many questions there. I mean, if you I asked this question at the World Bank in a talk I was giving. I said, how many people in the audience think that by 2040, the majority of high schoolers in the United States will be learning online? And I tell you, 70 to 80% of that room shot their hands up. And I think that's fascinating to me. And I think we are seeing an interesting push forward, push back cycle where we run hard at the latest online learning craze and then we realize, oh, that sucked. And there is, I think, a shared and growing understanding that blended learning, or learning that happens in person and online, is the best way, is the most effective way to learn something, to connect communities around shared topics, even if it's not always feasible. But I think we're seeing online learning really going through a lot of interesting growing pains. You saw like MOOCs were all the craze in 2013, and I think that massive open online courses, I think there is a strong pushback saying, hey, all we've done here is put a lecture hall online. We haven't really fundamentally changed the way we learn, the pedagogical approaches that underline it. We could do better. But like, given the power of technologies like Zoom, which we're using right now, to be able to actually manage visual real-time conversations and communication, that's got so great in the last few years. So to me, like, there are all these new potentials opening up every day that take us beyond where we currently are.
Is it true that 70% of people are tactile learners as opposed to auditory or visual learners? And if so, how is technology going to be able to address this 70% of the population that learns by touching, feeling, getting their hands dirty?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a lot of research. Sorry again for the sirens. There's certainly a lot of research around experiential learning and what constitutes experiential learning. Is it physically touching things? Is it being and smelling and seeing something directly in front of you? There's a lot of people in the virtual reality, augmented reality space that are trying to figure this out. Like, what is immersive learning? There are studies that have been done that say, like, all right, if you just hear things, you retain this much. If you see things, you retain a bit more. If you're able to touch them, you retain a bit more. There are also studies that say, if you're able to teach somebody else the content that you have learned, that you will retain it better. There are studies that have been done that say if you take notes by hand, even with an online course, you will retain better than taking notes on a computer. There's some pretty fascinating angles that have been researched and approached with retention meets the human brain. And to me, it's just like a fascinating, growing, evolving space where there's some body of agreed upon, this is how learning works, but there's a whole bunch we don't know. And we're still learning every day. So it's actually quite an exciting time to watch the space.
Can everybody be taught?
Maybe. I don't know. I believe deeply that when somebody says I didn't learn anything in an online course, I generally say, I assume that we haven't engaged them well. Like, it's not a fault of the learner, it's the fault of the person. And we haven't addressed the whole person. We haven't really thought through how the medium has helped or discouraged their ability to learn. So in a sense, I do believe everyone can learn. Now, having said that, if we're talking about online learning, there's like a baseline digital literacy you need to be able to engage the virtual content. You need to know how to use a computer or a phone. You need to learn how to type. You need to do certain basic functions that even allow you to engage with the medium. So yes, everybody can learn, but there's a lot of complexity there.
Interesting. So I did a recent tour in Silicon Valley where I stayed there for a few years. And in Silicon Valley, it's very fashionable to shut your startup down after 6 months if it's not $1 billion company or on track to that already. And in contrast, a lot of the entrepreneurs that we knew that came out of Swarthmore have shown an incredible grit where we've worked at our startups for years, sometimes 5-10 years is the case with yourself, TechChange, myself, ResScore. What's your thought on that? Is it better to do it the way that we've been doing it, or are we fools for sticking with something 9.5 years after it's not become $1 billion company?
We are fools, but this is in my mind, this is the only way, Garrett, and obviously I'm biased here because I'm on the same journey you're on, but I do believe this quite deeply, that like, to really understand a problem, to really get in the weeds with what it is you are trying to change about the world, it is not a quick fix. Scale might happen quickly, but the nature of problems that we are up against are immensely complex. Our ability to solve them with teams of people is always, hamstrung and challenged by so many factors. Sometimes money, sometimes just people are messy, right? We all have all these desires and aspirations for where we want to be in our careers, and those don't always align with where the company is headed and what we're trying to do as a team. And so all of that just means, in my mind, this takes a long time. It takes a really long time. And if you look at nonprofits, I mean, so many of them have been around for decades, if not longer, all trying to sort of address different aspects of in some cases, a singular problem. And it evolves, it changes, the problem evolves, the tools we have at our disposal to address those problems evolve. And so, like, to say that we didn't solve a problem in 6 months and therefore not only did we fail, but it's also not worth it to keep going is sort of crazy to me. So that's how I come down on it. I'm sure there are people out there, investors, saying I need to make money in a certain amount of time with my portfolio, and if I don't see that manifest, then this isn't a worthwhile expenditure. Fine. But to me, it's about the nature and the complexity of problems.
One thing I always like to ask successful people such as yourself is, are there habits or systems that you've implemented in your daily, weekly, monthly life which you found have made you or helped contribute to your success that other people could copy? And I'm not like a deeply methodical process-based person. I'm much more of a relationship person. Mm-hmm. And I guess so for me, it's not like at every morning I drink 3 cups of coffee or eat 4 almonds. It's really like, the advice I would give is, like, you never know where or how a relationship will come back in your life. And so for me, as a relationship person, as a CEO, like, I'm always sending out like gratitude and helpfulness to a network and not expecting anything in return. And I'm doing that daily, and I'm doing that in many ways. And I'm assuming that most of the time it may never come back in a way that's useful to me, but that's still the energy I'm putting forward into the universe. But sometimes it does come back in the most random ways, in the most unexpected ways. And so, like, as like a daily practice for success, I think it's always thinking about the long term. It's always thinking that like 15 years after Garrett and Nick graduate from college, we'll be on a webinar together. Like, you never know what life holds. And so to me, what's very frustrating is when people bring a short-term mindset into a startup and they say, well, I haven't seen this progress by this time, or I personally need to be feeling X, Y, and Z, and I'm expecting a trajectory for my career to go like this. Careers are like, ebb and flow with so many factors. And I just worry that we're expecting too much from them and not patient enough. So anyway, that maybe not the advice you were looking for, but that's kind of where I come down on a big picture topic. I think that's a very good answer. Both long-term thinking and accumulating karma would be the way I would describe those.
Sure. Yeah.
Are there any topics that we didn't discuss that you'd like to talk about?
Oh man, so many, Garrett.
I got to keep going.
Other than our budding acting careers, which did not materialize.
Well, we're on right now.
acting 101 that we took. What was that, junior year of college? No, I think, man, this is what a cool conversation to be part of, and I'm just really excited for you and your journey at ResScore. And I do my best to share with everybody I can, because I think it's just such an amazing gift to the world. So
I do appreciate it, and that's one of the reasons that I thought of you when I was thinking of people that I want to interview. But just on top of that, it's very impressive to me what you've been building at TechChange. So
cool, man. All right, well, good luck. And if anybody has any questions, I don't know where and how this will live, but I'm always happy to follow up and talk more.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time.